The vast expanse of space stretched out endlessly before him, the stars twinkling like distant beacons in the void. Commander Marcus Doran stood on the observation deck of the Valor, his gaze fixed on the planet below. Yatura, a world of dense jungles and dangerous wildlife, a planet that was now a war zone in humanity's endless conflict with the Icarian Empire. The war had been grinding on for years, with no end in sight, and Marcus had long since grown used to the unrelenting pressure of battle. But something about the events of the past few days had left him unsettled. It wasn't the mission itself that lingered in his mind. It was her, Lyra, the Icarian woman he had saved. The mission had seemed straightforward at first: retrieve vital data from a downed Icarian scout ship deep in the hostile territory of Yatura. Marcus had led his team with precision, as he always did, expecting the usual dangers: enemy patrols, the planet's aggressive native species, the treacherous terrain. They had located the wreckage, a twisted heap of metal and fire buried in the thick foliage of the jungle. But when they found Lyra pinned beneath the debris, everything changed. She wasn't like the other Icarian soldiers he had encountered over the years. When Marcus first laid eyes on her, she wasn't the cold, calculated warrior he had come to expect from the enemy. She was hurt, vulnerable, struggling to breathe beneath the wreckage, her body bruised and broken. Her wide golden eyes, filled with pain and fear, had met his, and for a brief moment, Marcus had hesitated. He had his orders: no survivors, retrieve the data, complete the mission. His finger had hovered over the trigger of his blaster, ready to finish her off, but something in her gaze stopped him. There was a flicker of humanity in those alien eyes, a raw plea for life. She wasn't just an enemy combatant, she was a living, breathing being, desperate to survive. And in that moment, Marcus couldn't pull the trigger. "Get her out of there," he had ordered, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite place. His squad had been stunned. They exchanged glances, confused, questioning his decision. They were in the middle of enemy territory, surrounded by danger, and here he was, risking everything to save an Icarian. But Marcus didn't explain himself. He didn't know how to. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her to die. They had extracted her from the wreckage, carefully lifting her fragile form from the twisted metal and carrying her back through the dense jungle. The tension among his team had been palpable. Whispers of dissent, sideways glances, their unease growing with every step. They were soldiers, trained to kill the enemy, not save them. But Marcus had been resolute, his voice firm as he ordered them forward. The journey back to the ship had been perilous. Yatura was an unforgiving planet, its native predators lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. Icarian patrols were likely scouring the jungle for survivors, and they had to stay on high alert. Marcus could feel the weight of Lyra in his arms as they moved, her breathing shallow, her body limp. She was barely conscious, slipping in and out of awareness, her golden eyes fluttering open only to close again moments later. Every step felt like a gamble, every rustle of the leaves a potential threat. But Marcus didn't waver. He was determined to get her to safety. When they finally reached the Valor, the ship's medical team had taken her immediately, stabilizing her wounds and setting her up in the med bay. Marcus had stayed close by, watching from the shadows as they worked on her. The doctors hadn't questioned his orders, but their glances had said enough. This was highly irregular, even by wartime standards. She was the enemy, and bringing her on board wasn't just a risk. It was a violation of protocol. Over the next few days, Lyra remained in a coma, her body healing from the trauma of the crash. Marcus had found himself visiting the med bay more often than he had anticipated. At first, he told himself it was to monitor her condition, to ensure she wasn't a threat. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, something that drew him back to her bedside time and time again. When she finally awoke, it had been in the dead of night. Marcus had been sitting in the dimly lit room, his gaze distant, lost in thought. He didn't notice at first when her golden eyes fluttered open, her breath catching as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. But the moment her gaze landed on him, everything changed. She tried to sit up, her body tensing as panic set in, but her injuries made it impossible. Marcus had moved quickly to her side, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he had said softly, his voice calm, though he wasn't sure if she could understand. "You're safe." Lyra's gaze had darted around the room, taking in the sterile medbay, the unfamiliar technology, the humans bustling around in their white coats. Her breathing was labored, fear evident in her wide eyes. She was in enemy hands, and she knew it. Marcus had tried to explain the situation as best he could, his voice gentle but firm. "You were injured. We brought you here to help you." She didn't respond, but her body slowly relaxed, her panic subsiding as the reality of her situation sank in. For a long moment, they had just stared at each other, the silence heavy between them. The days that followed were awkward at first. The language barrier made communication difficult, and Marcus wasn't sure how to approach her. She was still the enemy after all, and while he had saved her life, he couldn't be sure she wouldn't try to escape or retaliate. But as the days passed, Lyra began to open up, little by little. She was quick to pick up on English, learning basic words and phrases faster than Marcus had expected. Their conversations were halting at first, filled with pauses and misunderstandings, but they found ways to communicate. Marcus learned that Lyra wasn't just a soldier. She was a skilled pilot, one of the best in the Icarian fleet. Her mission had been a reconnaissance operation, meant to gather intelligence on human positions, but her ship had been shot down before she could complete it. As they spent more time together, Marcus found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was a quiet strength to her, a resilience that he admired. She had been through hell, yet she faced her circumstances with a calm determination that reminded him of himself. Despite the war, despite the violence and bloodshed between their people, they had more in common than he would have ever thought possible. One night, as they sat in the medbay, the stars twinkling outside the observation window, Lyra had asked him the question he had been dreading. "Why did you save me?" Marcus had hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He didn't know why. It had been an impulse, a gut reaction, something he couldn't explain. He had seen her there, vulnerable and afraid, and something inside him had compelled him to act. "I don't know," he had admitted finally, his voice quiet. "I couldn't let you die." Lyra had studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher the truth. Then, to his surprise, she had smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. From that moment on, their bond had deepened. They spent hours talking, sharing stories of their lives before the war. Marcus told her about Earth, about the sprawling cities, the vast oceans, the simple pleasures of life that seemed so distant now. Lyra, in turn, told him about her home world, a place of towering crystal spires and endless skies. They found solace in each other's company, an unspoken understanding that transcended their differences. But the war was always there, looming over them like a dark cloud. They both knew that their time together was temporary, that sooner or later, the realities of their situation would catch up with them. And when that day came, they would be forced to part ways, perhaps forever. It happened sooner than Marcus had expected. One morning, as he entered the med bay, he found Lyra standing by the window, her back to him. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her expression somber. "They're coming for me," she said quietly. Marcus's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The Icarian Empire had sent a rescue team, and they were preparing to extract her under the cover of darkness. Lyra had to go back to her people. "I understand," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't want to let her go. Lyra stepped closer to him, her golden eyes filled with emotion. "I wish things were different," she whispered. "So do I," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. For a long moment they just stood there, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging between them. Finally, Lyra reached up and placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'll never forget you," she said softly. "Neither will I," Marcus murmured, his heart aching, and then, before he could say anything else, Lyra turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the ship. As Marcus watched her leave, he knew that their paths would likely never cross again, but the memory of her would stay with him, a constant reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still room for compassion, for connection, for love. The days that followed Lyra's departure were a blur for Marcus. He went through the motions aboard the Valor, executing orders, overseeing drills, and participating in briefings, but his heart wasn't in it. Every corner of the ship reminded him of her, the laughter they shared, the quiet moments of understanding, the warmth of her hand against his skin. The crew members noticed his distraction, the way he seemed lost in thought even when surrounded by people. Whispers circulated about his state of mind, but no one dared to approach him directly. Meanwhile, Lyra's absence felt like a void that swallowed him whole. Marcus often found himself staring out at the stars, the memories of her laughter echoing in his mind. He had learned so much from her, not just about her world, but about the complexities of their conflict. She had opened his eyes to the idea that perhaps they weren't so different after all. Humanity often painted the Icarian Empire as a faceless enemy, but Lyra had been a person, a remarkable woman with dreams, hopes, and fears. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of their situation weighed heavily on Marcus. The Valor received new orders, a mission to engage in skirmishes against Icarian forces on another planet. As they prepared for battle, he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. He could still hear Lyra's voice in his mind, urging him to remember that there was more to life than just war. One evening, during a routine briefing, the captain called for a strategy session to discuss their upcoming engagement. As the officers around the table laid out plans, Marcus sat in silence, his heart pounding. The thought of facing Lyra's people, of potentially killing more of her kind, sent chills down his spine. The mission was critical for their war efforts, but he felt a deep conflict within him. How could he fight against someone who had once been so close to him? After the meeting, Marcus found himself wandering the ship, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He needed to clear his head. He stepped out onto the observation deck, the stars twinkling brightly against the backdrop of the vast cosmos. As he leaned against the railing, he closed his eyes, recalling every detail of Lyra. The way her hair caught the light, the fierceness in her gaze, her soft laugh. "Commander Doran," a voice interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Lieutenant Samira standing nearby, her expression concerned. "You've been distant lately. Is everything all right?" Marcus sighed, leaning back against the railing. "I'm fine. Just thinking." "You're worried about the mission," Samira said, crossing her arms. "It's understandable, but we need you focused. The crew looks up to you." He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Instead, he just nodded. The truth was, he was terrified. Not just for himself or his crew, but for Lyra. What if they encountered her forces? What if he had to fight against her? The mission day arrived quickly, and as the Valor dropped out of hyperspace, the tension was palpable. The crew sprang into action, their faces set in grim determination. Marcus moved through the ship, checking in with each department, but his mind was elsewhere. As they prepared to engage the Icarian fleet, a wave of dread washed over him. He stood on the bridge, staring out at the swirling chaos of enemy ships in the distance. The captain began issuing commands, and the ship shuddered as they initiated their offensive maneuvers. "Engage!" the captain shouted, and the crew responded with a unified roar. Marcus felt the adrenaline surge through him, his training kicking in. But with every shot fired, every enemy ship that fell, a part of him broke. He remembered Lyra's face, her courage in the face of danger, and it hurt him to think of her on the other side. Suddenly, as they closed in on a group of Icarian ships, Marcus spotted a familiar craft weaving through the chaos. A sleek silver vessel that looked strikingly similar to the one Lyra had piloted, His heart raced, a mixture of dread and hope. Could it be her? Was she there, fighting for her people, just as he was for his? "Commander," Samira's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to focus. There's heavy resistance ahead." But Marcus couldn't tear his gaze away from the ship. He had to know. "I'll take a fighter and scout ahead," he shouted, determination flaring within him. "Marcus, you can't." Samira started, but he was already moving, striding toward the hangar bay. Before anyone could stop him, he climbed into a fighter and launched into the fray. The chaos of battle enveloped him as he flew through the swarm of ships, dodging enemy fire and weaving between the explosions. He could feel the rush of adrenaline, the thrill of combat, but all he could think about was finding her. Then, in the midst of the chaos, he saw her. A flash of silver and blue, her Icarian ship engaged in a fierce dogfight. He couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and fear. Lyra was every bit the pilot she had claimed to be, navigating through the onslaught with grace and precision. Marcus's heart pounded as he maneuvered his fighter closer, his mind racing with the implications. Should he help her? Should he engage her ship? Would she remember the bond they shared, or would she see him only as an enemy? The thought terrified him. As he approached, he realized she was in trouble. An enemy fighter had locked onto her ship, firing relentlessly. Without thinking, Marcus engaged, his instincts taking over as he launched his missiles toward the enemy ship, hitting it squarely and sending it spiraling into the void. "Lyra, it's Marcus," he called through the comms, praying she could hear him. "I'm here to help." For a moment there was silence, and Marcus's heart sank. Had she forgotten him? But then he saw her ship turn, her silhouette framed by the explosions behind her, and her voice came through the comms, breathless and shocked. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "I'm fighting for you," he shouted back, determination flooding his voice. "Let's get out of here together." The tension in the air was electric as they maneuvered through the chaos side by side, their ships dancing through the stars as they took down enemy fighters one after another. It felt exhilarating to fight alongside her, to feel their connection reignite amid the chaos of war. For the first time since they had been separated, Marcus felt a sense of hope. Maybe they could survive this together. But as the battle raged on, the Icarian reinforcements began to overwhelm them. The tide turned against Marcus and Lyra, and they found themselves surrounded by enemy ships. Marcus's heart raced as he glanced at Lyra's ship, knowing they were running out of time. "Marcus, we need to regroup," Lyra shouted, her voice urgent. "They're closing in." "Follow me," he called, leading her into a narrow canyon on the planet's surface where they could momentarily evade detection. They dove into the chasm, weaving between the rocky outcroppings, adrenaline fueling their flight. Once they were hidden, they took a moment to breathe. The gravity of the situation crashed down on them, the sound of battle echoing in the distance. "What are we doing?" Lyra breathed, her eyes wide. "We're fighting our own people." "I know," Marcus replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "But we can't just give up. We have to find a way out of this." They exchanged a look, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. They had been enemies just weeks before, yet now, in the midst of chaos, they were allies, bound by circumstance and perhaps something deeper. "Where do we go from here?" Lyra asked, her voice softer now, tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." Suddenly, alarms blared on their ships, indicating that the enemy had found them. The moment of respite was over. "Get ready," Marcus shouted, his heart racing. They had to move. As they launched out of the canyon, they were met with the sight of Icarian ships descending upon them. It was time to make a choice, fight or flee. Marcus felt a rush of determination as he glanced at Lyra, knowing that no matter what happened, he would fight for her. "Together!" he shouted, and Lyra nodded, her expression fierce. They dove back into the fray, their ships weaving through enemy fire. As they fought side by side, Marcus felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This was where he belonged, fighting not just for his people, but for the connection they had forged amidst the chaos of war. Finally, as the battle reached a fever pitch, Marcus saw an opening, a chance to escape. "This way, we can break through!" he called, leading Lyra toward the gap in the enemy lines. Just as they were about to make their move, an enemy ship opened fire on them, hitting Marcus's fighter. The impact sent him spiraling, alarms blaring as his control panel lit up with warnings. "No, Marcus!" Lyra shouted, panic in her voice. He struggled to regain control, but it was slipping away. "Get out of here, Lyra! You have to go!" he yelled, desperation flooding his words. "Not without you!" she cried back, determination in her voice. But as the enemy forces closed in, he knew the truth. She couldn't save him, and he wouldn't let her sacrifice herself for him. "You need to survive. Please," he urged, his heart breaking at the thought of leaving her behind. With one last look, Lyra's eyes filled with tears, understanding the weight of his words. "I'll come back for you. I promise," she shouted, and then she broke away, darting through the opening he had created. As he watched her disappear into the distance, Marcus felt a sense of loss wash over him, but he also felt a flicker of hope. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for, and he would do whatever it took to survive, to make it back to her. With renewed determination, he turned his ship around, engaging the enemy forces with every ounce of strength he had left. The battle was fierce, but in his heart, he knew he wouldn't give up. For Lyra, he would fight until his last breath. As the chaos swirled around him, he fought on, the memory of her smile guiding him through the darkness, promising that this wasn't the end.